Welcome to this session of literary criticism. We would be looking into the rise and decline of new criticism. Let's begin with the early stages. Among his contemporaries, T.S. Eliot exerted profound influence on new criticism. When The Sacred Wood was published in 1920, it started a trend in criticism, mainly descriptive then, termed new criticism. The term was put into use by Joel E. Spingarn, and all its major practitioners have been either English or American. In 1941, the poet John Crowe Ransom wrote a book reviewing the criticism of I.A. Richards, T.S. Eliot and War Winters, to which he gave the title The New Criticism. In Ransom's book, there is an essay titled Wanted an Ontological Critic, where he pleads for the establishment of an intellectual movement that deserves to be named new criticism. In America, the movement asserted itself as a reaction against the existing modes of critical practices that were characterized by subjectivity and aesthetic impressionism. Such an appreciation of art was evident in the philosophical humanist movement of Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer More, the Marxist principles of Granville Hicks and Edmund Wilson. The impetus to the rise of new criticism is also seen in imagism in poetry and Hume's essay Classicism and Romanticism. John Crowe Ransom taught his principles to his students Ellen Tate and Robert Penn Warren, who later developed their own new critical practices. Eliot, in his essays Perfect Critic and The Imperfect Critic, mentions that criticism should be devoid of personal emotions and good criticism is the outcome of a refined sensibility. The American new critics are John Crowe Ransom, Ellen Tate, R.P. Blackmer, Kenneth Burke, War Winters, Cleon Brooks, Robert Penn Warren and William Wimsatt. The English new critics are I.A. Richards, William Empson and the scrutiny critics Lewis, L.C. Knights and Derek Travers. Though the American and British new critics shared many attitudes, they differed from each other on the philosophic notions of criticism. New criticism does not represent a group of critics who share the same opinions and beliefs. Each critic is highly individual in his proposition. However, both these groups of new critics opposed the system of literary criticism that existed during their time. Let's move into the characteristic features of new criticism. First, new criticism denounces historical and biographical methods of literary criticism that were prevalent during the 19th and the early 20th century. The historical and biographical approaches give importance to extrinsic factors such as history and biography to critically comment on a text. New critics, however, concentrate on intrinsic factors such as the text and its words. Second, intentional fallacy and affective fallacy are considered impediments to objective criticism. According to the new critics, the text provides all evidences which can be analyzed and verified by locating image, metaphor, plot, character, rhyme and meter. The new critics view the literary work to be an autonomous verbal object. Its complex meaning cannot be deciphered through paraphrasing or translating it into another language. The fourth point, the new critics emphasize close reading. This term is derived from I.A. Richards' Practical Criticism, published in 1929, and William Empson's 7 Types of Ambiguity, published in 1930. A close reading of a text is done when the reader analyzes diction, meter, sound, imagery, narrative structure, point of view. rhyme scheme and other techniques to express a point of view and to develop a deep and precise understanding of the text's form, craft and meanings. The new critics seek to determine the function and appropriateness of these elements to the self-contained work. The next point, new criticism is of the view that the nature of literary language is different from the scientific or the common language. While the scientific language points to the world outside, literary language organizes linguistic resources into a unique kind of arrangement in order to create aesthetic experience. The sixth point, the form of literary language is inseparable from its content and meaning. When a text means and how it means it are the same. A work has an ideal organic unity in which all elements contribute to create a whole. It is through this unity that a new critic values a literary work. The organic unity contributes to the complexity of a work. The seventh point, the complexity of a work is often the result of multiple meanings that are produced by devices such as irony, paradox, ambiguity and tension. These devices contribute to the harmony of a work which provide an interpretation of human experience. The next point, the examination of the formal elements which contribute to the unity of the work is called close reading. There are also other figurative elements such as images, similes, metaphors, symbols and myth which unify a work. Let us look into the postulates of new criticism. The new critics maintain that their interpretations are solely based on the context and the language of the text. Their critical practice is called intrinsic criticism. This means that criticism takes place within the purview of the text. All other methods are called extrinsic because they are the external causes, details or tools that are required for interpreting the text. New criticism insists on focusing on the text alone. Basically, new criticism is founded on the premise that the text is an autotelic artifact, which means it is complete in itself and exists for its own sake. The relationship of the text with the world beyond itself does not appeal to the new critic. The practice of close reading of the literary text advocated by the new critics brought together many critics who differed widely in their methods of close reading. Let us now move into the Chicago critic. Associated with the University of Chicago from the 1940s, the Chicago critics are a group of formalist American literary critics that influenced American criticism during the latter half of the 20th century. The prominent critics of this group are Richard McKeown, R.S. Crane, Elder Olson, Bernard Weinberg and Norman Maclean. They are called Aristotelian or Neo-Aristotelian because of their interest in form and genre. They gave importance to the judgment of the author's solutions to particular problems in the construction of the text. Critics and Criticism, Ancient and Modern, published in 1952, edited by R.S. Crane, contains the precepts of this school of critics. A detailed analysis of the theory of this group's method is found in Crane's book, The Study of Criticism and the Structure of Poetry, published in 1953. Wayne C. Booth is a second-generation Chicago critic who applied the principles of the Chicago School to fiction that is explained in his book, The Rhetoric of Fiction, published in 1961. We will now look into formalism, a group that is closely associated with the new critics. Formalism is also known as Russian formalism. It is an innovative literary school of criticism that developed in 20th century Russia. The school comprises of two branches: the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1915, and Opoyaz in 1916. The members of the Moscow Linguistic Circle included Osip Brick, Boris Eichenbaum, Yuri Tianov, and Boris Tomaszewski. Opoyaz is the acronym for the Russian words that mean Society for the Study of Poetic Language. The school was led by Viktor Shklovsky and started functioning at St. Petersburg. The formalists emphasized form and technique over content and looked for the specificity of literature as an independent verbal art. Formalists postulated the emphasis on the medium by finding out how literature, especially poetry, was able to alter artistically or make strange common language so that the everyday world could be defamiliarized. They based their assumptions on the linguistic theory of Ferdinand de Saussure and symbolism, but objected to Marxist interpretation of texts. Their notions of autonomy of the text and the discontinuity between literary and other uses of language were acceptable to the formalists. However, they preferred greater objectivity and scientific critical approach compared to the symbolists. They studied the various functions of literariness as methods to separate poetry and fictional narrative from other forms of discourse. In 1929, the movement suffered a setback when it was condemned for lack of a political outlook. The structural linguist Roman Jakobson introduced the methods of formalism to the Western world, and the American new critics adopted some of its principles. For this reason, American new criticism is sometimes referred to as formalism. However, several objections were laid to the precepts of new criticism. We now move on to the objections. Several prominent literary critics challenged new critical methods during its heyday. René Vallée, in his essay The New Criticism Pro and Contra, declares that new criticism has become outdated, and he gives 4 reasons. First, its disregard for the social function of nature. Second, the unhistorical method of criticism. Third, it aims to make criticism scientific. And fourth, it seems like the revival of the art for art's sake movement. This critical practice is only a tool useful at the level of trying to learn literary texts and poetry in particular. The Chicago critics refer to the new critics as the radical reformers of literary study. They object to new criticism because its method of reasoning is deductive and dialectical. It forces everything into a fixed method, making it inappropriate for literary study. R. S. Crane, one of the Chicago critics, attacked Brooks and the other new critics for their critical monism, which was evident in their unquestioning adherence to poetry and continued preoccupation with lyrical poetry. Alfred Kazin, in the early 1940s, accused new criticism as fetishized formalism. The myth critics criticized new criticism. A myth is a system of symbols or metaphors which is a central device in new criticism. The myth critic identifies myth with literature. They are not concerned with judgment or evaluation. They discuss myth as part of the content apart from the poem itself. The Geneva School, the structuralists and the Russian formalists disagree with new criticism. The new critics' ahistorical approach to the study of literature was denounced because they depoliticized literature and thereby maintained a political status quo. The early 21st century critics found that new criticism was limited in focus and maintained severe methodological procedures for the analysis of texts. We now move into the contribution of new criticism. New critics are not averse to historical knowledge, but they feel that it should be subordinate to the interpretation of the poem. The new critics Glenn Brooks and War Winters are known to be historical scholars. For the new critics, poetry is not cut off from the world, but it is always directed and bound by it. They stand for the organic unity of the poem. They are formalists because they see the poem not as an act of communication, but as an artifact which contains a certain principle of organization. The new critics are opposed to science, and this notion is not acceptable to those who maintain that criticism could be considered science. New critics do not agree to all the views held by the Russian formalists. They stress the cognitive value of poetry and consider poetry to be a unique object of knowledge which has a special ontological status. Criticism is not a lifeless and a neutral science. Close reading is encouraged. It is viewed to be an activity that leads to judgment and discrimination between good and bad poems. The new critics proposed close reading to foreground the unity of a work. New criticism considers a work of art to be a structure with its own principles. This structure has coherence and unity and does not depend upon its origins or effects. It does not yield to abstract knowledge. The literary journals such as Southern Review, Kenyon Review and Sewanee Review promoted the critical writing of the new critics. In spite of the contribution of new criticism, it did have its own drawbacks that led to its decline. We now find out the crucial factors that were responsible for the decline of new criticism. The new critics have done much to advance literary criticism and understand the literary form. However, new criticism declined on the grounds of opposition from several movements. Structuralism opposes the focus of new criticism on individual works and isolation. Deconstruction rejects the assumptions of new criticism, while the new critics proposed a close reading to stress the unity of a work. Deconstruction proposed deconstructive close reading to reveal the fissures, discontinuities and instabilities within a work. The notion of objectivity of new historicism is different from that of new criticism. In the late 1960s, the status and influence of new criticism decreased. Modern theories that emerged during the late 20th century analyzed the limits of new criticism through revision and extension of its concepts. New criticism is a realization of the assumptions drawn from Aristotle, Kant and Coleridge, recreated and merged, culminating in the modernist literary tradition. With the influence exerted by several new fields of analysis, new criticism declined as a critical practice. The new critics had underemphasized the roles of the reader and the poet by overemphasizing the object, which is the poem. This gave rise to the counter movement called hermeneutics. In opposition to the neglect of the role of the reader in literary studies, reader response theories and reception aesthetics materialized. Structuralists and post-structuralists emphasize the flow of textuality. There is no way of separating the text from the influence of intertextuality, and there is no special form of the language for poetry. New criticism is responsible for the emergence of other related studies like women's studies, black studies and comparative literature, which have become popular in literary criticism. In this sense, it can be stated that new criticism has paved the way for widening the scope of literary studies from diverse perspectives. Let us now have a thorough study of what we have done so far, probably explain everything in a nutshell. Developed by a group of American critics who taught at southern universities after the First World War, new criticism is seen to be an approach to literary studies that is anti-impressionistic, anti-historical, and against social and biographical concerns. This school of literary criticism came about in the 1920s and 1930s. The rigorous study of the text and its inherent elements was central for new literary criticism. The American critic John Crow Ransom describes the novel approach to literary criticism in his book The New Criticism, published in 1941. New criticism emphasizes close attention to the internal parts of the text itself and denounces external evidences to explain a work. The method followed by the new critics could be characterized as close reading and concentrating on formal aspects like rhythm, meter, theme, imagery and metaphor, among others, for interpreting the text, because these aspects espouse the structure of meaning within the text. The concept of the poem as a coherent, organic whole, which reconciled its internal conflicts and achieved some final balance, was proposed by Coleridge, and the new critics followed his dictum. Privilege was given to poetry over other forms of literary expression. Poetry exemplified the literary values which they endorsed. However, the techniques of close reading and structural analysis of texts have been applied to fiction, drama and other genres of literature to a certain extent. New criticism continued to influence literary circles, and its approach of analysis as a strict, clear and direct practice was followed until the 1960s, where its influence began to wane. With the rise of Marxist, hermeneutic, structuralist and feminist criticism in the 1960s, new criticism paved the way for a variety of theoretical and historicist literary concerns. All this said, we have now questions for you, so that you would be able to answer them and understand more about new critics, their contribution, the reasons for the rise of new criticism, as well as the reasons for its decline. Until we meet in the next session with a new topic, this is me saying bye. Thank you.